bicycles are big business. It's hard to get an exact figure, but estimates suggest there are around 2 billion bikes in the world today. And of course, they exist in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Town bikes, racing bikes, foldable bikes, mountain bikes, electric bikes, and many, many more besides. They're available in cutting-edge, high-tech versions, but the underlying design is very simple. They're very green. Once built, they can be repaired and resurrected. Some of them live for ages, handed on from generation to generation to generation. But bicycles weren't always around, and perhaps it's worth reflecting a little more on their history, not least because it can teach us some useful lessons about innovation, and in particular how or how not to manage it for impact and scale. Now, what do you do when you've invented the wheel? Well, in the earliest days, we're talking around 3500 BCE, the Mesopotamians used them to make pottery, which seems to be the first practical application of this breakthrough idea, the wheel. The problem with using wheels for transport wasn't so much the wheel itself as finding an axle strong enough to enable those wheels to work. And that took another 300 years before new materials and better carpentry techniques led to their being fixed onto chariots and ushering in the era of mobile warfare. But once the wheels started rolling, they were attached to an increasing variety of military and domestic vehicles. So it was only going to be a matter of time before someone came up with the idea of using them to enable personal transportation. Well, quite a lot of time, actually. Although there's probably a sketch for something resembling a bike somewhere in Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks or in some other great inventor's imagination, the reality was that it wasn't until the early 19th century that the vehicle that we now know and love began to see the light of day. That shouldn't surprise us. Innovation depends on a mixture of needs and means, and the idea of personal transportation, never mind the technologies to enable it, was not a particularly high priority. People didn't travel far, and if they did, nature had already supplied a robust solution in the form of horses or mules, camels, and other alternatives. Now, the average human being can walk at around 5 kilometers per hour, so covering any distance is going to take time and effort. Enter Baron von Drais, a minor aristocrat in Germany, who in 1817 came up with the Laufmaschine, a walking machine, otherwise known as the Draisien. Now, he was already an experienced engineer and inventor, having come up with several working prototypes for devices like a piano music recording system, a periscope, and a typewriter. All of them ideas which turned out much later to have considerable significance, but not in the form that he developed them. And he had a passion for horseless transportation. Now, this wasn't some idle curiosity or pet project. Times were tough in the years of the Napoleonic Wars, and grain prices were high, something not helped by the failure of the harvests in 1816. This was the so-called year without a summer, when the fallout, literally from a volcanic eruption in Southeast Asia, blotted out the sun. People died of starvation, and horses had an even harder time of it, either starving themselves or else being used for food. The possibilities of their being used for transportation shrank faster than the poor animals themselves. Now, Baron von Drais was also aware of new technologies and materials which he could make use of, and he developed a working prototype of his machine on which he could cover the kilometers around his hometown of Karlsruhe. He experimented with variations, including a four-wheeled passenger carriage powered by an unlucky servant whose job it was to pedal on planks connected to the wheels. But Dreis's breakthrough idea was a two-wheeler, the Dreisienne. This did away with pedals. Instead, the rider sat and scooted along the ground with his feet, a kind of adult version of the child's hobby horse. But there was nothing childish about the impact this had on moving around the place. On the 12th of June 1817, a crowd gathered along the best road in Mannheim, Germany, to watch him climb aboard and set out for the Schwetzinger Releshaus, a coaching inn located in nearby Rheinau. Less than an hour later, he was back, having completed the 13-kilometer round trip in a quarter of the time it would take to walk. Now, he was a man of vision, and he saw the potential for what he'd built. By October 1817, he'd produced a 3-page brochure of Laufmaschine designs, which pictured possible applications, such as for military couriers or in the postal service, as well as for the general and leisure transport world. He proposed different models with 2 and 4 wheels, even a tandem, and potential customers could choose between standard machines or customized versions. The French version of the brochure, published a year later, included accessories such as lamps, an umbrella, even a sail to help with extra momentum on windy days. Now, Dreis's Laufmaschine was pretty heavy by today's standards, weighing in at 22 kilograms. It was made mostly of wood, but with hoops of iron nailed to the wheels to function as tires. This design had an unfortunate side effect, because it made any journey on the fairly primitive roads of the time somewhat less than comfortable. But at least the machine was blessed with a brake on the rear wheel. Perhaps more important was some of the technologies Drais put to use in his design, like the brass bushes inside the wheel bearings, which enabled the wheels to turn freely, and a trailer to the front wheel which helped the rider maintain balance. Now, Drais had the vision to see the possibilities in his machine, but he didn't really have a business model to help him create and capture value from it. Although he staged a number of impressive demonstrations all around Europe, the reception was mixed. And once the novelty wore off, the market retreated to being one mainly for hobbyists and pleasure seekers. Riding rinks, where customers could rent a machine for an hour or so, appeared in the parks of various European cities. But that mainstream dream of providing personal transportation faded. It wasn't helped by the appalling state of the roads at the time. Without any form of shock absorbers and with those iron wheels, the seat, despite being well padded, was not a comfortable place to spend much of your day. Now, all's fair in love and war is a principle which often also extends to the world of innovation. The pattern is often one of imitation, and the first mover isn't always the one who can gain advantage, especially if they have inadequate protection for their intellectual property. Drais had tried to patent his idea, but it only applied locally, a loophole quickly spotted and exploited by an Englishman, Dennis Johnson. Now, he'd seen the early demonstrations and guessed at the significant opportunities such machines might offer. So he set about patenting the idea in England, and then building in more systematic fashion a business model around which that idea might be exploited. Johnson was a coachmaker, so he quickly worked out how to build the machines. What he had to do was create and grow the market. He advertised, offered demonstration machines, organized racing competitions, even established 2 riding schools where people could learn the skills involved. He adapted the product so that his pedestrian curricle, that's what he called it, had a ladies' walking machine variant with a lower saddle such that women could mount the machine decorously. He was particularly successful in attracting the attention of the young men of the time. Now, this was the era of Beau Brummel and the London dandies, and they enthusiastically took up the idea, adding to it all sorts of fashion accessories, boots, gloves, and so on, without which the daredevil owner would not be seen about town. Its popularity among this group was heightened by the inherently unsafe nature of something ridden about narrow streets at relatively high speed, which offered thrills and often accidents aplenty, until an increasing number of city authorities began banning the machine, which of course increased its appeal. It was an expensive hobby, retailing for about £10, that's around £750 today. It carried additional running costs. Riders wore out their expensive leather boots surprisingly rapidly, and the imposition of fines of £2, that's £150 today, for riding on the pavement added to the burden. The fashion for Draisiens began to fade, but the real reason for their failure to reach that wider market was down to something much simpler: economics. By 1820, the high price of oats had come back down to pre-1815 levels, and horses were now readily available again to those who could afford them. Innovation isn't just a gleam in the eye or a flash of insight and then instant creation. It's a lot of hard work, experimentation, and improvisation to bring that dream to reality. As Johnson had shown, there was plenty of scope for doing things better, sorting out the bugs and wrinkles, continuously improving on the design. It's a pattern of restless experimentation, pushing the frontiers of what might be possible. Metalworking technology in particular was improving such that machines could be made strong and relatively light, displacing wood as the only means of construction. People explored using different numbers of wheels, 2, 3, 4, more even, opening up the possibilities of carrying multiple passengers. But innovation is also about sudden leaps, of someone picking up something very different, taking on the baton, and giving that wheel an extra hard push that sends it off in a new direction. Sometimes it's about timing. A technology which wasn't available early on suddenly appears, or a market which didn't exist before begins to grow to the point where there's demand for the innovation, pulling it in new and refreshed directions. Whatever, this pattern of punctuated equilibrium is at the heart of most innovation stories. And in the case of the bicycle, it certainly was. Drais' machine had a big limitation. You had to push it along with your feet. It might carry you faster along roads you might otherwise have strolled along, but you still had to do the hard work. So, alongside all the other innovation experiments was a big push towards finding a better power system, with some successes. For example, Willard Sawyer in Dover in England successfully manufactured a range of treadle-operated four-wheel vehicles and even exported them worldwide in the 1850s. But while treadles and hand-operated cranks offered interesting propulsion options, it was the idea of pedals which turned out to be the game changer. And here we have another example of an innovation phenomenon: multiple independent innovation. People experimenting at the same time with access to the same technologies and the same level of information are quite likely to come up with similar solutions. And human nature being what it is, there's also a fair bit of copying or even stealing of other people's good ideas. So it's not surprising that we can find many claims to the fame of having produced the first pedal-powered bicycle. In Germany, there's a statue to a man called Karl Kech, who claimed to have been the first to attach pedals in 1862. But many would argue that he was a latecomer to the party, that the original inventor lived and worked in a small Scottish village called Keir, where he'd been using pedals for 20 years before that. Now, if you're going to have a mysterious legend to weave about the next phase of bicycle innovation, where better to do it than Scotland? Land of lowering mountains, shady glens, deep lochs, and plenty of rain to fill them, shrouded in mists and secrecy, and home, amongst others, to a blacksmith called Kirkpatrick Macmillan. Now, Macmillan completed construction of a pedal-driven bicycle made of wood in 1839, one which also included iron-rimmed wooden wheels, a steerable wheel at the front, and a larger wheel in the rear, which was connected to pedals via connecting rods. Now, various accounts tell of his travelling about the roads near Keir and regularly making the journey to the town of Dumfries, 14 miles away, in less than an hour. He was a modest man, and his claim to innovation fame doesn't rest on patents, but more on public relations, particularly handled by his relative James Johnston in the 1890s, who had an ambition. He wanted to prove that to my native country of Dumfries belongs the honour of being the birthplace of the invention of the bicycle. He might have been a little creative with his reworking of history, suggesting, for example, that Macmillan was the gentleman in question in a Glasgow newspaper report in 1842 of an accident in which an anonymous gentleman from Dumfriesshire, bestride a velocipede of ingenious design, knocked over a pedestrian in the Gorbals and was fined 5 British shillings. Now, a criminal record is perhaps not the strongest piece of intellectual property protection, and a more robust claim to be the pedal innovator lies with the French. Specifically, a young blacksmith and machinist from the town of Nancy called Pierre Lallemand. He developed his ideas in 1863, showed them off publicly during the next year, and then moved to the United States in 1865. And in the following year registered the US patent number 59915 for his version of the velocipede. Most people give him the pedal crown, and with it the title of inventor of the modern bicycle. But moving innovation to scale involves building systems, not just creating components. If you're going to make a success of bicycles, then you need to bring several pieces of the puzzle together into a workable configuration. You need a location where you can build an early market. You need access to technology and expertise, a distribution and support network. Who's going to maintain the machines once people have bought them? You need an ability to produce at scale and a lot of money. In the case of bicycles, this wasn't going to be found in the wilds of Connecticut, where Lallemand was careering down hills. His bike only had rudimentary brakes. No. It was going to be found on the wide, flat, and pleasantly surfaced — tarmac was a recent innovation — on those streets of Paris. In the early 1860s, Pierre Michon, yet another blacksmith, had a successful business producing parts for the carriage trade, and had diversified into making velocipede à pédales on a small scale, pedal bicycles. Across Paris, 2 brothers, André and René Olivier, were students, but they also came from a wealthy family. This enabled them not only to be early adopters of the bicycle, enjoying a memorable road trip in 1865 from Avignon to Paris, which took them 8 days, but also helped them get the feeling for becoming the first real entrepreneurs in the game. They'd seen firsthand the potential in pedal cycles, and they teamed up with Michaud, brought in another friend, Georges de la Boublisse, and in 1868 set up a partnership to make and sell their bicycles. Now, they brought several key innovations in their system, changing the wooden frame for one made of 2 pieces of cast iron bolted together, which helped enable mass production. The only problem with this design was it kept breaking, and customers were understandably somewhat annoyed. Fortunately, theirs wasn't the only company moving into this space, and another small firm in Lyon had developed a different design using a single-piece frame with a diagonal bar made of wrought iron. The Michaud company quickly adopted this and then continued to dominate the fledgling industry over the next 10 years. For a while, France, and Paris in particular, with its smooth, flat roads, became the focus of a market which grew in popularity on both sides of the Atlantic. But a combination of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, which stopped French cyclists, and bad roads whose bone-shaking characteristics held back even the hardiest of North American users, meant that the center of innovation gravity moved to Britain. Now, pedal power depends on how much you can push, and cycle design next began to explore ways of maximizing this. 2 wheels of equal size aren't particularly good in this equation. Better is to have as long a stride as possible, since the larger the wheel, the further you can go with one rotation of the pedals. So wheels became higher and higher and higher, the only limit being the length of the rider's legs. It's an idea which is good for propulsion, but not so good for steering or balance. And so bicycles became ever more exotic looking in their arrangements of wheels and sizes, not least giving birth to the familiar penny-farthing shape. But although high wheelers experienced some market growth, they weren't really practical for the average man or woman on the street. Enter John Kemp Starley, an English inventor who came up with a winning idea for a safety bicycle, one which would appeal to a much bigger market. His first model was the Ariel, launched in 1871, and although still featuring wheels of different sizes, it was getting closer to a configuration which people would accept. Not least because he integrated many of the key features which people valued. Improvements in stability, comfort, usability, especially steering, and all at a price they could afford. Starley was a classic innovator. Over the next 15 years, he developed an increasing range of machines, drawing in ideas and technologies from all over the place, learning all the time with the market about what it actually wanted, not least through the experience of dissatisfied riders. For example, he sorted out the problem with the wheels. Those early bikes had heavy wooden wheels with iron rims, but in 1849, William Stanley had invented steel wheel spider spokes, making wheels much lighter. In 1868, Eugène Mayer in Paris developed an all-metal wheel that relied on the tension of wires rather than compression of heavy metal spokes to achieve a structural integrity. 2 years later, and an Englishman, William Henry James Grout, a builder of velocipedes from Shadwell in London, patented his version of spokes, which were much lighter still. Now, Starley drew all these ideas together to create and patent the spoked wheel in 1874, which gave a much more comfortable ride because of its sprung nature. But it also made bicycles much lighter. In similar fashion, he took other ideas and used them as ingredients in the innovation soup, which was coming nicely now to the boil. Finally, in 1885, Starley introduced the Rover. With its nearly equal-sized wheels, central pivot steering, differential gears operating a chain drive, Starley's Rover was the first highly practical iteration of the bicycle. It was like Henry Ford with his Model T 20 years later. What Starley had done was produce the bicycle for every man and every woman. It became the dominant design, and it's pretty much the same shape as we would recognize today. Starley's work kick-started the industry into its growth phase. His company grew, and with it the product range, opening up cycling to a wide market in ways Baron von Drais had dreamt about 70 years earlier. The safety bicycle completely displaced the high wheeler, and by 1889 there were around 200,000 bicycles on the roads of Europe. 10 years later, over 1 million machines were being pedaled around the world. And innovation didn't stop there. With each new development, the pace of growth accelerated. Pneumatic tires made of rubber made for a smoother ride. Chain drives meant that the power came from the rear wheel, leaving the front wheel free to steer and making it much easier to go around corners. The application of gears helped tame even the most stubborn of inclines and opened up literally the whole landscape to conquest by bicycle. And inventors began looking at alternatives to legs as the main power source, with, for example, a battery electric bicycle appearing. And then over in Germany, Gottfried Daimler played around with hooking an internal combustion engine up to a cycle to create the motorbike. So it's not entirely surprising that we do now have over 2 billion bicycles pedaling their ways along roads and up and down mountainsides all around the world. And there's still plenty of scope for further innovation, branching in new directions and picking up old ones. Today's e-scooter craze looks like becoming a fairly good candidate for one of those next shifts, with not a few nods back in the direction of poor old Baron von Drais with his Laufmaschine. What is clear, though, is that these innovations will only take hold and become widely adopted if we pay attention to working at the system level. Successfully scaling an innovation like this is all about wheels within wheels.